Jamin AI. Jamin AI.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. So today we're going to be kind of digging into this idea of faith and politics.
Okay.
And you know how, like, especially during election season, people always bring up these religious sayings?
Right.
Like almost like a comfort blanket sort of thing?
Yeah, definitely.
And we've gotten some really interesting material from your listeners about that, like this article by Jamin Bradley. He's a pastor, theologian.
Okay.
And he really digs into how some of these sayings, these like platitudes we hear all the time, might actually be doing more harm than good.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, those phrases can be really comforting for people, so it's not always easy to hear them challenged.
For sure. It's kind of like, you know, that saying, a comfort zone is a beautiful place, but nothing ever grows there.
I like that.
So we're going to push ourselves to think beyond those comfortable phrases a little bit today. And Bradley starts right off the bat with one we hear constantly: God's not surprised. Like, no matter what crazy stuff is happening in the world, God's got it all figured out.
Right, but Bradley's argument is more nuanced than that.
Okay.
He's saying God doesn't just see the future, but all the potential futures. So it's less about God having this, like, pre-written script and more about understanding every possible outcome.
Oh, interesting. So our choices still actually matter in that scenario.
Exactly. Our choices carry a lot of weight. Think of it less like a straight line and more like all these branching paths, you know?
Right, like a choose your own adventure.
Yeah. And God can see all those possibilities, all those choices, and how they might play out. Bradley even uses those examples from the Bible, like God's regret after the flood, or even after making Saul king.
Oh, right.
Like maybe even God, knowing all that could happen, still felt a kind of regret that things unfolded the way they did.
Wow. So it's not like God knew exactly how everything would go down, just that he could see all those different possibilities.
Exactly. It really adds a whole other level to those stories, don't you think?
It does. Makes it way more real in a way.
And it really changes things, doesn't it? Because if God can be surprised, then we're not just these puppets acting out some predetermined plan.
We actually have a say in how things go.
We have agency, responsibility for the choices we make. And that leads us to another big one, another phrase that gets thrown around a lot, especially when things feel chaotic. God's in control.
Oof. Yeah, that one always feels loaded.
Right. Because on the one hand, yeah, on like a cosmic level, sure, God's ultimately in control of everything. But when we start applying that to the messiness of human events, it gets a lot more complicated.
That's true.
Well, he really challenges us to think about what we mean by God's plan in those situations.
Good.
Like, just because someone's in a position of authority, like a president or a king or whatever, does it automatically mean they're always acting in accordance with God's will?
You're saying we shouldn't just assume that everything that happens, even the bad stuff, is because God willed it to be that way.
Yeah. Right. I mean, what about human sinfulness, ambition, even just bad judgment?
Yeah, those definitely play a part, right? It's not like leaders are somehow immune to making bad choices.
Exactly. And Bradley actually points to some examples in the Bible that complicate this idea of leaders always acting on God's behalf.
Oh, really? How what?
Well, there's Psalm 82, which talks about these, like, lesser gods who are messing things up.
So not exactly following the divine playbook, huh?
Not so much. And then there's Revelation, which has that whole image of political powers being influenced by these dark forces, like, yikes.
Yeah, that's definitely not God's in control in the comforting sense of the phrase.
Right. It makes you wonder, like, if that phrase is supposed to be reassuring, does it really line up with, like, the actual realities of history and the world we see around us? I mean, it's a tough question, but Bradley wants us to really wrestle with it.
For sure. And it makes me think about another phrase we hear all the time, maybe even more than God's in control. God chooses our leaders.
Ooh, yeah, that one. Always a crowd pleaser, right?
Right. But Bradley, he hasn't let us off the hook with that one either.
Definitely not. He asks this really pointed question in the article. Do we only say God chose this leader when it's someone we already support? What about those leaders who do awful things? Did God choose them too?
It's easy to talk about God's plan when you like the outcome, not so much when you don't.
Exactly. It's like, are we really looking for God's will, or are we just trying to find a spiritual justification for what we already believe?
That's a good point. But what about that idea of, like, being subject to governing authorities? Doesn't the Bible talk about that?
It does. Bradley brings up how Paul wrote about it, especially in Romans.
Okay, so Paul was all about falling in line with whatever the government said.
Well, not quite, because here's the thing. Even Paul, who advocated for respecting authority, he still ended up clashing with the government a fair amount himself.
Oh, right. He got into some trouble, didn't he?
Yeah, he definitely pushed back against the Roman authorities. I mean, he even challenged the very foundation of their power, so it wasn't just blind obedience for Paul.
So there's more to it than just saying God put them there, so we have to do everything they say.
Exactly. And Bradley reminds us that for Paul, it was all about justice. It wasn't about blindly following whoever's in charge, but about working toward a world where leaders actually use their power for good.
So maybe we should be a little more discerning before we just say, God chose them and call it a day.
Right. Like, are we really trying to understand what God wants, or are we just looking for a religious rubber stamp on our own political views?
Yeah, that's kind of what it feels like sometimes, Like we use these phrases to opt out of actually thinking about what's going on.
It's easier than really engaging with the tough stuff.
For sure. But Bradley, he takes it a step further and asks us to consider something pretty intense.
Oh yeah, this part really stuck with me.
What if we were to take these same phrases, God's in control, God chooses our leaders,
right,
and apply them to something truly horrific, something like the Nazi regime?
It's a jarring thought experiment, isn't it?
It really is. Like if someone were to say, well, God's in control, so the Holocaust must have been part of his plan, or God chose Hitler to lead Germany.
It just wouldn't sit right, would it? It forces us to confront the potential consequences of hiding behind these, easy religious answers when faced with real evil, real suffering.
It's like those phrases. They can almost become a shield that protects us from having to really look at what's happening and our own role in it all.
Exactly. It's easier to say, well, it's all part of God's plan, than it is to actually ask ourselves, what does my faith demand of me in this situation? How do I act justly in the face of this kind of darkness?
The whole thing about faith without works being dead, right? It's not enough to just say the right words. We have to actually do something.
Exactly. And Bradley doesn't shy away from that at all. I mean, he even says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he basically says that if your go-to political statement could also apply to Hitler, you might want to rethink that statement.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful. He really doesn't let us off easy, does he?
He pushes us to dig deeper, to wrestle with these ideas instead of just settling for the easy answers.
And to really think about how our faith should inform our actions in the real world, not just be something we talk about on Sundays.
Absolutely. This deep dive has really given me a lot to chew on. What about you? What's sticking with you?
It's that call to move beyond the simple answers and really engage with complexity. Because like we were saying, it's easy to fall back on those platitudes. But when we really start to think about what they mean, especially in light of history and current events, it gets a lot more complicated.
Definitely. It's tempting to want those clear-cut answers, but the reality is faith and politics, they're both messy, and we have to be willing to get our hands dirty to wrestle with those tough questions.
It's like instead of just saying, well, God's in control, so I don't have to worry about it, we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to live out my faith in the midst of all this? To really fight for justice and work towards a better world?
Those are the questions that really matter, aren't they? It's not about having all the answers, but about wrestling with the questions in a way that informs our actions.
Absolutely. And that's something we can all do, no matter where we stand on the political spectrum or how strong our faith is.
For sure. It's a lifelong journey of learning, questioning, and hopefully growing.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deeper.
The weight of the world feels heavy on our hearts. We search for comfort, we're drifting apart. With empty phrases, we try to find peace, but truth gets lost and our doubts don't cease. Oh, don't think God's not surprised when our choices lead to lies. In a world where power plays, let's find a better way. No more hollow words, no more easy grace. It's time to face the truth we can't erase. God's still in control, we often say, but in our hands the power slips away. With rulers shows us the paths we have tread. When faith turns to fear, we silence the dread. Let's speak for justice. Let's challenge the wrong. Together in truth we'll rise up strong. Oh, don't think God's not surprised when our choices lead to lies. In a world where power plays, let's find a better way. No more hollow words, no more easy grace. It's time to face the truth we can't erase. We can't erase. So when the world feels heavy, let's stand and fight. With hearts full of hope, we'll shine our light. In the midst of the chaos, we'll find our voice. Embracing our call, we will rejoice. So when the world feels heavy, let's stand and fight. With hearts full of hope, we'll shine our light. In the midst of the chaos, we'll find our voice. Embracing our call, we will rejoice.